Welcome to What Keeps Us Going, the podcast that redefines hope, joy, and resilience for people of color, one story at a time. Victoria is a first-generation Asian American who's never taken any opportunity for granted. Her curiosity and tenacity led her to graduate from both high school and college early, where she studied at the University of Utah's Eccles School of Business. And for opportunities that weren't there, she made them. She founded and served as executive director of the Asian American Pacific Islander Students in Business, while also being a part of numerous organizations, including Women in Business and Out for Business. But for Victoria, it's more than the accolades. Her upbringing informs how she navigates spaces that were made for her, creates community, and manages her mental health. Let's get into it.
Okay.
We've had several conversations leading up to this point around mental health. And I appreciate you being open enough to share your story when it comes to mental health. So what I like to start with is, at what point did you realize mental health was something to consider?
What do you mean by consider?
So what I mean by that is I think about mental health and physical health, and that both need to be taken care of. But since I was a kid, it was always physical health, physical health, physical health. In terms of, at school, we learned about the food pyramid and how to eat in a balanced way. I had PE, recess for play. I was taught to go to the doctor every year for a physical exam. Both at school, I had to have an exam, and then at home, it was also taught to me to have this physical exam. But mental health wasn't ever part of that conversation. And so I'm wondering for you, as you think about a holistic view of health, at what point did you start considering mental health a part of that equation?
I feel like similarly, I grew up focusing a lot on physical health, and it was only until middle school for me where my environment, especially my academic environment at schools, was talking about mental health, but very minimally. They never actually mentioned it was mental health. I think when I was in middle school, it was during the whole increase of no cyberbullying. And so each year they would bring people in and be like, no cyberbullying, know what bullying is. But then it started to shape itself into, you need to take care of yourself. There's a lot of different things, and so how are you going to take care of yourself? Adequate sleep, but that also plays into physical health. And I feel as though I really only took a real dive into it in high school when it became more prominent for me. But even before that, I wouldn't say I had the best mental health. And I only started learning or taking care of it when I was in high school.
Why? Why then?
I feel as though this goes more into my environment and what shaped me growing up, and my household especially, coming from being a first-gen student, a first-gen American, but also coming from an immigrant, and my parents are refugees, and that type of household. I feel like it was very prominent for my other friends as well who shared similar identities. Not a lot within like Asian American, but more like first gen or immigrant households, is mental health was never talked about. It was taboo. And I do quotations, and we can dive into that later. But it was taboo to be like, I'm sad. Or I feel as though growing up is like, oh, I'm sad. And the conversation would be like, well, I went through something harder. You shouldn't feel sad. Or different things like that. Conversation was never encouraged. And so, if anything, you were taught more to handle it, get through it, keep it to yourself. I feel as though I was also very encouraged growing up to not tell my issues or my feelings to people around me. But yeah, I would grow up and I just never really talked about it with anyone. But I was always a very emotional, empathetic person. Especially tapping into that emotional part. I was very emotional. Especially during middle school, But But I still didn't have that until I was in high school, and some things happened while I was in high school, and then I realized I was like, okay, yeah, I need to address this. This is very serious, or something that needs to be addressed, otherwise it's as serious as physical health.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to what you said about either being in a first-gen household, you were able to bond with some of your friends, some of your classmates around mental health, or being in an immigrant household. What about that kind of environment made it hard for you to feel? What about those variables created an environment that made it hard for you to feel like you could share your emotions?
I just want some clarification from your question.
Mm-hmm.
So what variables of such as a community external from my household made it possible for me to talk about it?
Not possible. It made it hard for you to.
We were all first-gen students. We were all coming from immigrant households. And also, I grew up in Utah. And so I'm from Utah. I was born and raised in Utah. Born in West Jordan, Utah. Where there isn't a lot of students of color or people of color, period. And so already having that first-gen or immigrant community wasn't there. I also grew up in a place where there was my childhood best friend is also probably the only other Asian that I grew up with. There was only 2 of us out of a whole city. And yes, there's a lot more Asians, but we weren't surrounded by them. We weren't with them, or they just were not in the spaces we were in, or our schools. The hardest thing is, though, we're all navigating this space and realizing and having the mindset, talking about mental health or sadness makes you weak. It's taboo. You're showing vulnerability. And growing up and knowing, like, you shouldn't show that. So I feel as though that community of POCs, people of color, they weren't able to talk about these things. So that is one action. Talking about it is an action, but also not talking about it is an action. And so it didn't really encourage that environment for me to speak. I feel as though the only time it became a thing is if I were to introduce the topic and then they felt comfortable enough to insert themselves into the topic or open up. But even that takes time. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does. It does. Well, what happened in high school?
In high school, so just to take it a little back, in middle school too, I was always a very like go student, a go kid. I did a lot of things. I wanted to be a part of a lot of things. A bunch of clubs. Very social, very extroverted. I was a very chatty kid. Still am. I guess some things will never change. But being a part of everything and realizing, this is a lot. And then also holding an emotion, like whenever I felt a specific thing, and during a time in middle school, you're feeling a lot of emotions. It's a transition. I remember elementary into middle school, I was like, what's this? Like, how do you expect me to go to all these classes? And then that was different from going middle school to high school, which is even more. I might be digressing, but let me joke back. I was going through a lot of emotions, and that seeped into high school. In high school, I just was so stressed and anxious all the time. So stressed and anxious. And being in an environment, both political and social climate, that is highly conservative, very, I don't want to say anti-DEI, but they didn't speak about diversity because we didn't have diversity. And if we did, it felt kind of like tokenized. Growing up, I felt that way all the time. But in high school, I had a really hard time managing my emotions. And so I did finally start caring about mental health, but only me. It was something that was very foreign for my parents still, or my household, and that's a hard thing to transition to when I'm the youngest and going into that. I had the support of my sisters. My sisters kind of understanding it because we grew up like that. We grew up in America. We're first-gen Asian Americans, and learning about mental health. So I had my support from my sisters and sometimes my teachers. Not so a lot of my friends, but I struggled a lot with anxiety. I was diagnosed with MDD, which is major depression disorder, also known as clinical depression. And I didn't know how to deal with these different things. Mm-hmm. So I would go to the doctor. I would sometimes talk about these different things, and I would go to my mom, of course. For me to even go to the doctor, I'd be like, "Mom, I feel like I need to go get checked up," and then she'd be like, "Why?" She's like, "You're just sad. Get over it." Mm-hmm. And my mom still cares about me. I know she meant well, but she was like, "Oh, that's not like that big."
Right.
But I think it's also me playing a part of like it being taboo and growing up with not the stigma, maybe stigma, that it was not okay to talk about it. I probably downplayed it at the time, knowing myself.
Yeah.
And so even at like going back to physicals, annual physicals, I would go to my doctor, tell them about my worries, and they're like, "Oh, it's about that time in your life when you're a teenager and you're going through all these emotions." And so they had me take the test. I got diagnosed, and they were like, "Oh yeah, you got massive depression."
Well, what made you feel comfortable enough to even tell the doctor?
To tell the doctor?
Yeah. If it wasn't something that you grew up with talking about in your household.
I call it festering, like the emotions fester. I don't feel as though it was like comfortability. It was more like it has to come out or not. When you're in such a time where you're letting the emotions from middle school, from 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, just holding it all in, and it just all comes out. I felt as though, like, you know, when my doctor would ask me certain questions, I'd be like, "Oh, this is how I actually feel." And then doctors being the way they are, they're like, "Oop, red flag."
Yeah.
And it was an uncomfortability thing, but I also think I do trust doctors a lot, and so that's why I was like, "Oh, this is going to be between us." I was a minor. Of course it's going to be shared with my mother. It's just going to be between us, Doc. Yeah. No. And then that happened. And so when I was around, when I was in like 10th grade, like 9th grade I had some emotions. A lot of emotions. 10th grade was when I was like really getting to different emotions. Some things happened in my life where it's like contention, stress, contention. It just kept building up, and then to the point where I was majorly depressed for a long time. And I remember having friends of color, and they were like, "Oh, I'm sad too." And, you know, I remember one specific friend, who I will not name, but they and I, we were both taking antidepressants at the time. And we were both like Zoloft besties, or like, we were like sertraline besties. And that's when I felt like some affinity. Having one person that I knew of that was also going through what I was kind of going through, they can kind of get it. But that was the only person I could talk to. But things built up, and I wish it didn't have to come to this, but I realized that because I was not talking about my emotions, and it wasn't really encouraged in my academic environment, my household environment, my friends, any facet of my life, for me to have an outlet, it festered to the point where it's November now. November 25th, 2018, I had my attempt. And it was such a major time in my life. And I know that if I actually did get the support that I needed growing up, like...
Attempt on your life.
Yes. If I had the support I needed in middle school and high school, that and I had the environment that really encouraged me and allowed me to talk about these things, probably wouldn't get to that point. And I'm very happy I'm here today. We're about to hit my 5-year anniversary. But I did have an attempt when I was 16 years old. And it was a major part of my development, I think. And one thing I look back when I do think about it sometimes is like, suicide attempts are calls for help. And when you're going through so much pain, so much grief, all these different things, it piles up. And when environments aren't built to recognize those symptoms, recognize those alerts, those red lights, and kids growing up, or they downplay their emotions, it leads to things like that. But yeah.
There are a lot of questions in my mind.
Take a note.
One question is, what led you to that attempt? What was there a? Had you been taking the antidepressants then? So what was it? What led you there? And you talked about some things. If some things were in place, what other things could have been in place?
So I was taking antidepressants at the time. And my personal experience with antidepressants during that time is different for many people. I know my experience is vastly different from other people. Sometimes antidepressants, they work on other people. But for me, it felt like it would make me numb throughout the day. And then at nighttime, when it hit night, all my emotions would come crashing down. Amplified. It built up throughout the entire day. And then boom. And so that was my experience. Some of the things that happened that year was quite interesting. I felt like, we talked about this before, the cyberbullying that we were taught in middle school. Things that happened in high school was like the lack of diversity was another hurdle that that really affected my environment. And so being in such a conservative state, and I always talk about this, and being one of the only people of color in a room does something to you. You stick out like a sore thumb, or you're the target of a lot of different conversations or topics. So I think I do have it in my mind, the different things that happened. One was I was navigating high school, a new space, major life transition. Social circles, I felt this immediate need. I was a student government girl. I was really big and really social. I felt all of these new expectations of me coming into high school and being like, oh, I have to fulfill all these needs or these expectations. And people had a lot of different expectations for me for when you're involved or you're part of student government. And I think the next thing was honestly, racism in that state. Racism had a big play. And being singled out in classes, or even, I talk about it a lot, and I feel like I do say it often, but I don't want it to lose its significance, is the model minority stigma. And that is a form of racism, even though some people are like, yeah, but everyone thinks you're smart because you're Asian. I'm like, yeah, but people hold me to a specific expectation, and when I don't meet that expectation, there's a whole nother sense of backlash that comes with that. No matter what end I do, I don't win. It's that expectation. I think the biggest one is expectations. I also had this personal expectation. I felt like I needed to do so much and do certain things to make not only my community happy, myself happy, my family happy. And I do understand that was self-induced, that anxiety. But I really felt like I had to make my family happy or proud or honor my family. That was another big part. And so I feel like all of those emotions and stressors coming from that, navigating a whole new space, I did have some other contentions with interpersonal relations. That were really just toxic. And so separated from those, but when you separate from a toxic person, there's backlash or retaliation.
Yeah.
And then I also had some physical issues where they didn't know what was going on with me and my body at the time. And you're growing up and you're a teenager and your body is literally changing. And so I actually had consistent doctor visits throughout the summer of 2018 and the fall of 2018. And so I was really stressed about that. That's another thing. Physical stress, social stress, psychological stress, and I think I had another spiritual stress, and if you might throw in household stress.
Yeah.
All these different stressors, but no outlet to express them, not even having the knowledge or ability to realize this is an issue. And so I was like, oh, that's something, whatever. Or I got into the habit of oh, that's something, suppress it. That's something, suppress it. And then it just all came out. And I was already in the habit of suppressing, and they were spilling out, and that's why I got diagnosed with MDD.
Yeah.
And so I started doing some stuff, but did it really help? Not really. So I had physical, all those different things, and that happened in a short amount of time. If you think of from summer into fall, it's compact.
Yeah.
And I had so many, I actually remember 4 big things happening in a span of 4 months. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. And it just brings you over the iceberg, tip of the iceberg, just knocks you out. And I just remember just not incrementally, drastically getting more and more sad. And that's just something I knew that my mom was really caring and worried during this time. But this is kind of diverges more into your second question, the supports put in place. I feel as though if my high school or my teachers and my advisors or certain people in my life recognized it more, and I don't want to put that stress on them, but truly having a system put in place is when a student is mentally high risk, and that's also another thing you can never identify. I was very good at masking. When you look at students that are high performing, highly social, different things, good at masking, no one knew why I did my attempt. They were always good old Victoria, always happy and doing her thing. Why would she do that? Was so shocking for people. But it's different things recognizing oh, Victoria messed up drastically on this assignment, or she didn't show up for class for this, or she's not talking as much as usual. Or even if my my doctors, they have it charted down by progression or decline. I felt like there could have been a warning sign there. Also, another one was really bridging the gap between parents and mental health. My parents didn't know how to navigate it. I know many parents in my school probably didn't even know mental health was a thing. So that was another thing. How do we educate our parents now? And some parents are amazing parents and they actively, independently go out, but some don't have that courtesy, that privilege to be able to actively do that. They have other things they have to worry about. Feeding your kids, getting food and money on the table, I
mean, as you were saying, your parents are refugees.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. My parents are refugees from Vietnam. So they actually met in a refugee camp. And that's where their love story began. And then they came to America. They actually came to California. And that's when, so they came here as refugees. And actually both my parents don't have a high school education. My mom came here when she was really young, took care of her siblings, and they just worked. Continuously worked, continuously grinded, and that was kind of not only what the American dream, I think, kind of instilled in them, but it's the American reality.
Mm-hmm.
You got to work to actually get money on the food on the table. And so already I'm very grateful for my parents for them coming here and allowing me to be in this space. It's already a privilege to be born American.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. The birthplace lottery.
Birthplace lottery.
Yeah.
But with that, they also had to take care of us. And so they had to take care of me, they had to take care of themselves. And so they've always been working constantly. And so when they first came here, they had nothing, no money, so they've just been working, and that's that hustler mindset that they instilled in me. And I feel like that's another thing that goes into mental health. When you instill hustler mindset, which is actually a capitalistic mindset if you think about it. But is that truly healthy for your kids?
Mm-hmm.
Is that truly healthy for them to, you just keep telling them, keep working.
Yeah.
It'll be rewarding. Keep working, express your emotions, keep working, until it blows up. And I don't think they've ever thought about that blowing up aspect.
I was in a conversation with one of our classmates about something similar. And you and I have talked about it. It's a scarcity mindset. And it's almost a privilege to not have to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you haven't had much, well, what does it look like to stop and to take stock? But if you haven't had much, stopping can reduce your opportunity to have the basic needs.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's so hard. But at the same time, the conversation a classmate and I had was around a big reason that your parents came here. You know, I see the general your parents, for those who come to the United States, is for a better future for their kids, right? And so that means that their experiences should be very different by design from the experiences of the parents.
But also, isn't it proven that some mental health is hereditary? And we were learning about this in class, that trauma can be distributed down to your children. When you experience trauma, it's kind of instilled in you. And so with that, I can recognize all the trauma that my parents have gone through. They've gone through war, they've gone through refugees, going through refugee camps, and all the horrors that come in refugee camps, and then having to travel to America, which the immigration process is horrid. Before, less horrid, but now it's horrid. Like, it's pain. But yeah, you would assume that our experiences, our identities, which are different. I'm not a refugee.
Mm-hmm.
But my parents aren't first gen either.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that kind of thing. You would expect that it'd be different, but they do instill certain values, habits. I very much have scarcity mindset, even to this day. And it's probably because it's a habit that my mom still practices. Sometimes it's understandable. Sometimes I'm like, Mom, put the extra napkins down. But then I realized that I do that here. Shit, I just pulled out napkins from my bag that I took from the library.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would assume that we would have different ones, but, you know, some things really travel. The way you talk, the way you walk, the way you read a book, the way you eat. That's just my thoughts on that, though.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And so it's November, and you have this attempt.
Mm-hmm.
What was going through your mind?
During this month?
Yeah, leading up to that moment.
You mean when I was in high school or now?
High school.
When I was in high school leading to the attempt? Sometimes I block it out. Sometimes I remember it clearly as if it was yesterday. I remember let's start fall months. August, September, October, November. 4 months right there.
Mm-hmm.
There was something that happened each of those months. I remember in September, I had a diagnosis for something else. I got diagnosed in September for PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome. And then that was a whole thing, trying to process that. My mom didn't know what it was, and that's a whole nother thing. Parents not knowing what a diagnosis is or different things, and so I had to, like, when you have to grow up or be an adult or understand things and have that conversation when you're at such a young age or still processing things, I remember being like, doctor, what does that mean? Like, what do I do now? Mm-hmm. Do I live with this? Am I gonna die? Or is this like something really small, like a fever? Like, what is that? Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, I went through a racist event in August. And, you know, dealing with racism, it wasn't my first time, but when it's like a first major time, you're like, did that just happen to me?
Yeah.
Processing that, September getting my diagnosis, this one, October, was my birthday, had some sexual violence, and then leading right up, I'm like, damn, this is my life? Is this what gonna be for the rest of my life? Something bad's gonna happen every single month.
Yeah.
But also having to process that, but not allowing myself to process it because I fester it.
Right.
And I just push it down. And so all I remember is, this is bad, oh my god, I'm feeling more sad. I'm just getting more sad and just accepting it, and then being like, oh, this is too much for me to handle. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. And then I did my attempt. And do I regret my attempt? Yeah, I do. There's so much beauty in life. And would 16-year-old Victoria be thinking that she'd be sitting here at Harvard at 21? No. And I was actually having a conversation with one of our classmates, and he was like, 5 years ago, me would not even think I would be here, let alone, like, in this field. And I was like, 5 years ago, me wouldn't even think she would have gotten this far, let alone be alive. I really thought, I was like, I'm done with this. If this is what living is, I'm not down with it. And I guess just with my thoughts is like, I didn't want to die, but I didn't want to go through all of these different feelings. Mm-hmm. At least that's what I think now. Maybe what I think then would have been different, or I would have said different. But those were my different feelings and chronological series of events.
What happened right after?
Oh, that was harsh. Well, right when it happened, it's that immediate thing being like, oh, I did something stupid. I don't want to talk about it. I want to forget about it. I remember 3 days after, I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. Like, not here, but I don't want to have to feel the aftermath, the consequences of my own actions. And I wanted everything to stop. And I knew what I meant by that is, like, I wanted to not talk about it, carry on, as if it was another old day. But I couldn't, because I did something so drastic. I did something so drastic that I had to stay in the hospital and then go to an inpatient psychiatric unit. Mm-hmm. And right after, actually, I'll be honest, I went on a trip with my sister. My sister's so kind. She really is. She was like, I want you to realize there's so many more beautiful things in life. So she took me in her car, and we drove from Utah to Denver to visit our other sister. And it was so nice. It was like, she was like, I want you to realize, like, there's mountains here, there's other things. Your life isn't stuck in that small bubble of West Jordan, Utah. Yeah. And West Jordan, and having to deal with all those different things. But yeah, I feel like after, it took me time. Well, I never really processed it. I think I also suppressed it again. Bad habit of mine. I started going to therapy more, realizing that I needed it. So I went to therapy more. And it was only until, like, I literally pocketed it to talk about it for a later day. And then only until when it was time, which maybe was like a year later. It's like, okay, I can talk about this. I've gotten over it. I've spent enough time not as sad, not as suicidal, having those suicidal thoughts, it declined. Were my emotions really high still, and I still suffered from MDD? Yes, but now I was able to, like, talk and reflect on it and be like, back then, that old Victoria, and the same way I think about it now, that old Victoria, whatever, she was out of her mind. But I think I've only been able to now talk about it openly. Maybe it was only until a year ago I started truly telling other people. Maybe a year or two. I started with the closest people in my life. Mm-hmm. And slowly working outward and being able to talk about it in this space, in this context, in this moment. First ever.
I appreciate you sharing. Victoria, how did it feel getting to the point of saying, that old Victoria?
Whoa. Elaborate.
So, there was a transition that took place. You're talking about a couple things. You talked about recognizing the need for to go into therapy at least more often. Mm-hmm. Then you said getting to a point where you could say that old Victoria. It almost as if it's, from where I'm sitting, there's a difference. There's a clear difference between the Victoria who had an attempt and the Victoria of, a few months post. Mm. Or at least, I don't know, maybe not months, but some time later. Mm-hmm. So how did it feel getting to the point of being able to verbally signify the difference between where you were then and where you once were?
I think that's a really hard thing for me to distinguish between. Mm-hmm. Because I'll be honest, right after, if you asked me a week after my attempt, it was November 25th, asked me December 25th, I would have been like, that old Victoria. Mm-hmm. But it was a time thing. Was it truly old Victoria? Mm-hmm. It was a time thing because I realized with my attempt, which was traumatizing for myself, but it was traumatizing for the people closest to me. It was not only for me. It traumatized my sisters, my parents, mm-hmm. anyone that really knew me. They had to be in that process with me too. I was a minor. But I think it was a thing of, I think a year later was appropriate time for me to say that because I was still going through it, but it was also in respect for the people around me. What they would say the old Victoria would be. It was a time thing, the phrase time heals all.
Yeah.
But I really felt like 3 days after my attempt, November 28th, I would have probably said that old Victoria. Big distinction. Before November 25th, I really wanted, I was suicidal. Yeah. This time I was like, no. That was a huge thing for me, but it's because I need to remember that my reactionary response, I want to forget about it. I just want to forget about it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't even want to acknowledge it. Let's forget that actually happened and keep moving on as if life was before. Yeah. And that was a privilege that I didn't recognize before. That I did like how the life was before. Do I now? I actually feel like I don't regret anything in my life. Some things had to happen for me to be the way I am now. But I think the real answer to your question is that change of mindset, but that appreciation for my life. That appreciation for who I am. And before I had a lot of, self-hate talk, I would say. Mm-hmm. Deprecating. But now, or a year later or months after, I was working through that because I was finally going through therapy. I was finally working on things that I was finally taking from my filing cabinet of suppressed emotions from the last few months and years, taking them out, reading it, being like, okay, let's work through this. And I would say that took a year to kind of skim through.
Yeah.
It's a lifetime to actually sit down and reflect. And I still don't think I'm reflecting right now. I'm reflecting on an event that happened 5 years ago and trying to work through my ability to talk about my attempt. I feel like now I can casually talk about it and be like, it is what it is. It happened. But now what we're going to do now. We're only in control of what our emotions and our feelings and our actions now.
Yeah.
So I was saying, did that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
It does. I have a few more.
Okay.
What does it mean? Because you talked about identity. And so I'll talk about identity is complex. So I'll talk about one piece of identity. What does it mean to be Asian in America?
Okay. That's an interesting one. Being Asian in America, for me, is different for someone that is from Asia being in America, and also being an Asian American. But also an Asian American in Utah has a different experience than an Asian American in New York or California. Well, my sisters who grew up in California, but also my cousins who grew up in California and live in California still, their experiences are vastly different than mine. But I think it's an identity thing of like, and what I mean by that is seeing and being with people like you. You have that affinity, you have that coalition, you have that community, those friends that you can talk about. And I feel like in Utah it was a big thing. If you see another Asian, you're immediately friends. You know, you're like, you understand what I'm going through, I understand what you're going through. We're in the trenches right now, we see each other. But that's not the same in California. When I go back to California to see my family, I walk through the streets as if I'm like anyone else.
Yeah.
Because I am anyone else. I walk into a store and I'm able to like speak my language with the people there. That's not normal in Utah.
Yeah.
It's very, very limited. And so to grow up in Utah is one thing. For the people that know what it's like to grow up in Utah, you know it. Growing up, and there's one specific friend, my childhood best friend. We've known each other since elementary, since kindergarten. We went to elementary school, middle school. High school was complicated, but technically we were still together in high school, and then we went to the same college.
Wow.
So everything, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, we would have times like away from each other, but every time we came back together and saw each other, it felt like we saw each other yesterday. We're the only like ones that we felt like shared our identity, being Asian American, and we don't even speak the same language. We have similar kind of backgrounds, because there was that whole phenomenon where people from China moved to Vietnam, and then that's why a lot of Vietnamese people, there's Vietnamese Cantonese people, a lot of them speak Cantonese, and then moved here. So her family's like that. Mine is too, but we don't speak Cantonese. We speak a different dialect of Chinese. She speaks Cantonese, but she doesn't speak Vietnamese. I do. So we already have a language barrier, but we have a similar experience.
Yeah.
And so with that, it's the identity of being able to eat the same food we eat in our households and go explore the different things that come with culture, that come with tradition. Things that we actually had to actively search for that didn't come inherently inside and outside of school. And it plays a big part, I think, in a person's development, period. Because when I'm in Massachusetts and I see another Asian, it's not the same. Of like, you see that one Asian across the street, you're like, you're my homie.
Yeah.
We're siblings, like, at that point.
Yeah. For black people, it's the nod.
Exactly. Yeah. It's for us, I don't know if it's for like for Asian people, we have one. I just know when I see it there, I'm like, I smile and I wave. And then usually we start talking to each other. I usually go up to them like, hey! And then we start talking about where we're from. We speak the same language. It's the immediate, you start speaking in that language if we speak the same language. Yeah. But that's how it's like in Utah, and it really did something on us, I think. I think we talk about it a lot, me and my best friend. We talk about it a lot growing up and even into college, because we took part in a lot of Asian American Pacific Islander and AAPI organizations and activism growing up.
Mm-hmm.
It was always a central part of us. Even in college, I created an AAPI organization, and she ran it with me. And we always were active in those different things, but that's the thing, you actively have to search for your identity. And that plays a big part in so many different identities. It doesn't have to be only racial, ethnic. In sexual, gender, all these different things, ability, disability. And I think, even here, I look for people from Utah, which is a whole nother thing. So I look at them and I'm like, can we talk about Utah? Like, Utah's a simulation sometimes. It's a simulation.
A simulation.
Yeah.
That's funny.
For sure. At least from a POC perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I'm digressing. What was your question again?
You answered it, just what it means. And I appreciate the distinction, because there is nuance in there. There's absolute nuance. And I recognize that identity is complex. And so there are multiple layers to it. Not only the layers that you mentioned, then it's also the where. Like where super important. And one last question, and then we'll get into a few rapid fires.
Mm-hmm.
Last question is, now, in your hardest moments, what keeps you going?
In my hardest moments, what keeps me going? I feel like we talked about this before.
But not with them.
I know, not with them. Not with them. Okay, let me tell this to them. Is that I think the biggest driving factor for me even to be here in this space, in this program to, well, what's like the end goal? It's a thing, is community for me. And that's something so big, is like being an Asian American student, growing up in Utah, not surrounded by that community, but having to build that community. That's the thing with identity. When you're a marginalized identity in such a place that is so, there's such a large contrast, you have to build that community. And in college, I recognized that, like, yeah, we had Asian American students, we did, but there was no resources built, and no organizations like really there to form. So I was like, if no one else is gonna build it, I'm gonna build it.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, I didn't only build it by myself. I had to build it with others. That's what makes it a community, is others. And so when I think about community, I think about those people along my journey that, even the Hugsy community. I would not be the person I am today, in this minute, in this second, without the conversation that we had. Any of them. Name one? No, I mean all of them. Even this conversation we're having now is going to affect me and influence me and impact me and make me a different person tomorrow. And so that community that I built in Utah, and those students, and those people, they aren't just students. They were students in that moment, in that time, but they're people. Those people, that the connections I've made with them, the friends that I was able to go eat McDonald's at 3 a.m. with.
Yeah.
Even those small things, but even the serious things, all throughout that spectrum. And along that line is that they keep me going. Because I realize people from my community, people with my identities, and even if they don't have my identities, people that have been historically minoritized or marginalized, they need that person. And even if they don't, like, say they need it, because we have each other, I'll be there to be with them. And the thing that drives me is my community, it's my people, my family, my found family. Both actual family as well, they drive me. But it's the people along, like, throughout my entire life that have made me who I am today. And I realize even my hardest days, you were loved. And people want you to exist. Even during times when you're having a really bad mental health day and you're like, no one likes me, or why do I even exist, or certain really deprecating thoughts, people still want you around. Even if you can't visibly see it and it's not tangible or in your line of sight right now, that idea, and I think I've grown into that now. I've really grown into the thing of like, you exist, and you should be happy to be who you are. Love yourself. All those really, I don't want to say cringy, or cliche things, but it really is. I tell my students, or even my friends and people back home in Utah, and I recently said this to some people, and I've recently started saying this, is I believe in the person you've been, I believe in the person you are, and I believe in the person you're becoming. And just having that and knowing that for others, but whatever you say, someone's probably thinking about that about you. Keeps me going. I hope that answered.
It did. So a few rapid fires.
Okay.
You brought up food.
Okay.
What are your favorite foods?
Oh, this is so hard. I'm such a foodie. I love food so much. Okay. That's so hard. I have to choose one?
Let's go with favorite kind of cuisine and then meal in that much.
Okay, I always say I love Asian food, but that encompasses so much.
It does.
When I say Asian food, when someone asks me this question, I always say Asian food because I'm like...
It's a cheat answer.
It's a cheat answer. Come on, but it's Asian food. Asian food... I do have a specific one. It's a home-cooked meal for my mom.
Oh.
Yeah. It's hard for me to explain. I've explained it to you before. It's called japsai. And it's like greens, and it's like tofu, mushroom. I love mushrooms, by the way. If we were to choose a specific thing, I love mushrooms. Like, I ate the other day, I bought a Costco-sized pack of mushrooms, and I sauteed them, and I ate a whole bowl. Like, I love mushrooms that much. But Asian food, like, I should just choose Asian food.
Okay, that works. Actually, okay, how about this? If somebody hasn't had Asian food before, what would you recommend that they try?
That's even harder, because there's like, everybody has to try Korean fried chicken.
Okay.
But there's all these other things. To whoever is watching, and if you're Asian, your cuisine is also included in that. I'll make a long list.
That's fair. Next question is, we talked before starting about books. What's a book you read in the last 2 years that stands out to you?
Wow. I remember the authors. I don't remember the full title because it's a long title. But it's a book about vulnerability and shame resilience. Actually, so it's called If You Are Your Best Thing by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. But it's If You Are Your Best Thing, :
Yeah.
I believe it's, If You Are Your Best Thing. It's an anthology and collection of different essays from people throughout the nation talking about Black shame resilience and vulnerability, and I think it's people should read it, really, because it dives deeper into a lot of cultural things, community things, about hustler mindset, being vulnerable, but shame resilience, and the resilience of going through shame of something, which is, I think, not a talked about topic a lot. So people should read that a lot.
One other question. What made you smile today?
Well, maybe it's not this.
Really?
Yeah. I felt like whenever I see you, we walked in, you were singing Arctic Monkey song, and I was like, yep, that's King, and I smiled, and then we hugged, and then we came here, and this whole experience, I think I smiled in this. Yeah, this has been nice.
Last question.
Okay.
What's a question I should ask the next person?
The question you should ask the next person. How are you really?
Okay.
And shameless plug, that's from my favorite game called We're Not Really Strangers. And it's a purpose-filled game of connecting with people. And one of the cards is, how are you really?
Beautiful. I appreciate it. You just listened to What Keeps Us Going with me, your host, King. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and a review at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Hope to see you around.